This episode is brought to you by Upstart. Hey Wisecrack, Jared again. Today we're returning to the underwater city of Rapture to talk about one of the most widely discussed video game franchises in recent memory, BioShock. Of course, longtime viewers will remember that we covered the philosophy of BioShock 1 and BioShock Infinite in the first ever Wisecrack Edition over 4 years ago. But you guys were pretty quick to point out that we made a purposeful but glaring omission in that video. So today we're finally going to go back and address the often forgotten, frequently maligned middle child of the BioShock franchise, BioShock 2. At the time of its release, BioShock 2 was noted for lacking the involvement of the series creator Ken Levin. In a 2010 interview, Levin said that he and his team at Irrational Games passed on developing the sequel because they wanted to avoid repeating themselves. We're always trying to challenge ourselves. We felt we had said what we wanted to say about Rapture, about those kinds of environments and that kind of feel. Despite this intimation from Levin that BioShock 2 is a bit of a rehash of the original, there's still a contingent of fans out there who remain steadfast in their belief that this is a great game, praising it for its improved mechanics and the spin it puts on the themes of BioShock 1. So now that we've had nearly a decade of distance from this potentially disappointing sequel, let's revisit BioShock 2 and evaluate whether it was as successful as some people seem to think, whether it reached the same intellectual heights as the franchise's first installment, whether it's deep or dumb. Welcome to this Wisecrack Edition on BioShock 2, and as always, spoilers ahead. But before we get to it, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors over at Upstart. They are the leading marketplace for providing personal loans if you have a history of credit card debt. Getting into debt is really easy, and getting out is hard, especially if your FICO score isn't great. Rather than focusing only on your FICO score, Upstart rewards you based on your education and job history in the form of a smarter interest rate. They also make it fast, simple, and easy to check your rate in just a few minutes without affecting your credit score. When a loan is approved, most people get funds the very next day. Over 200,000 people have used Upstart to pay off credit cards, student loans, fund their wedding, and make other large purchases, so free yourself from the burden of high-interest credit card debt by consolidating everything into one monthly payment with Upstart. They believe you are more than just your credit score. See why Upstart is ranked #1 in their category out of 300 other companies on Trustpilot. Go to upstart.com/wisecrack to find out how low your Upstart rate is. It takes a few minutes and won't affect your credit. And now, back to the show. Alright, first things first, let's do a little recap. In BioShock 2, you play as Delta, a prototype of a Big Daddy living in Andrew Ryan's underwater utopia of Rapture. Like all Big Daddies, you were tasked with protecting a little sister, and in the case of Delta, that little sister's name was Eleanor. In the game's prologue, Eleanor is snatched away from you by the main antagonist, Dr. Sophia Lamb, who then uses mind control to force you to commit suicide. 10 years later, you emerge from a Vita chamber having been miraculously resurrected. You are then led through the crumbling city of Rapture with the aid of Eleanor's telepathic messages and a little help from some unlikely allies. Your mission is to find Eleanor and save her from the sinisterly soft-spoken Sophia Lamb, who, by the way, is Eleanor's mother. Pretty soon, you learn that Dr. Lamb was once a celebrated psychologist in the heyday of Rapture. But after Andrew Ryan's death in the first BioShock, she transformed Ryan's failed objectivist utopia into a utilitarian collectivist hellscape. Lamb has manipulated the poorest, most disenfranchised citizens of Rapture through propaganda and plasmid addiction to be fiercely loyal to her and the rest of the Rapture family. What's more, the family deifies Eleanor as the first true utopian, because Lamb has been pumping her full of Adam in an attempt to create a completely selfless, completely altruistic being. Lamb's followers paper the walls of the city with iconography representing her and Eleanor that states, "We will be reborn, she is our savior." As you make your way to Lamb's hideout, you encounter her various allies who you can choose to kill or spare, depending on how generous you're feeling or how obnoxious their repeated dialogue is.
Okay, so dead men tell no tales, right? Wrong. See, with Adam involved, every stiff's got a story.
There's also a new class of enemies called Big Sisters, which are more sprightly, acrobatic versions of the Big Daddies that haunt Rapture's halls. There's still the same Little Sisters mechanic from the first game, which forces you to choose between saving the yellow-eyed innocents or zapping them for their precious Adam. As always, the choices you make determine what kind of ending you'll get, either good, bad, or neutral. That's pretty much it. You explore the city, blasting splicers in an attempt to rescue your surrogate daughter from the clutches of her evil mother. But BioShock has never just been a first-person shooter. The game set themselves apart from others in the genre with their rich world building, expertly paced storytelling, and use of philosophical texts to explore deeper themes.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
But just how deep can BioShock 2 get when it's starting at the bottom of the ocean? Part 1. The Triumphant Lamb We Worship. In its depictions of the cultish Rapture family and their fanatical worship of Sophia and Eleanor Lamb,
for grace, the paradise of Andrew Ryan was most unkind. She spoke against him in song, and he had her blacklisted. It left her penniless. But in the family, she has found hope, a reason to draw breath.
BioShock 2 offers some pretty decent commentary on the dangers of religious zealotry. Whereas the first game poked holes in Ayn Rand's objectivism by showing the natural conclusion of a utopia built on radical self-interest, BioShock 2 flips the script by presenting a criticism of blind, selfless devotion to a higher cause. While these two ideologies may seem at odds with one another, especially given that atheism is a central tenet of objectivism, the game takes great pains to show that they might have more in common than one might think. The people of Rapture, lost and leaderless following the civil war between Ryan and Fontaine and the death of both characters at the end of BioShock 1, are seduced by Lamb's philosophy and begin joining the Rapture family in droves. A skilled psychologist, Lamb plays into their anger at the system that failed them and promises them something greater through these new beliefs.
Alone, we are nothing. Mere engines of self-interest. Together, we are the family. And through unity, we transcend the self.
These people, many of whom struggled to feed themselves in Ryan's utopia, are now willing to throw their lives away at Lamb's word. We've seen this kind of zealotry throughout history, both religiously and politically, as people have thrown away their lives or political freedoms in the name of a higher cause. Lamb's targeting of the most poverty-stricken members of the population is more of a direct allusion to early Christianity, which flourished in the Roman Empire because of the church leaders' willingness to preach to and incorporate the lowest members of society. The fact that the word lamb is often used to refer to Jesus Christ is no more an accident than Andrew Ryan's name being a clumsy anagram of Ayn Rand. This mirroring of religious methodology is plainly obvious in the character Father Simon Wales. Once a downtrodden citizen of Rapture's poorest neighborhood, Wales is energized by Lamb's philosophy and converts it into simple religious doctrine that even the most atom-corrupted splicer can understand.
We believe in the daughter of the Lamb, hallowed Savior and anointed vessel, whose blood with our blood, sin with our sin, mind with our minds, life with our life, lifts us up from the depths, transcends base temptation, and delivers us all from ego.
The senseless death of Wales and his many followers underscores the danger posed by a complete surrender of the self. This is the antithesis of the first game's message, which focused on the danger of complete and total self-interest. BioShock 2's argument appears to be that things on the flip side can be just as bad, much like how the Terror Universe sequence in BioShock Infinite depicts the populist Vox Populi freedom fighters ruling over Columbia with the same authoritarian violence as Comstock. It's a cynical take, to say the least, but at least it's coherent, and a good reminder to occasionally criticize your own actions instead of giving yourself over to blind faith. For that reason, we're going to give this aspect of the game a deep. Okay, so BioShock 2 does a nice job criticizing overzealous devotion to Lamb's philosophy, but what exactly is her philosophy? Part 2, when the greater good goes bad. In the same way that Andrew Ryan was a physical embodiment of Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy, Sophia Lamb is an amalgamation of a number of different utilitarian thinkers, most notably John Stuart Mill. Mill was a British philosopher born in 1806 who was seen by many as the direct successor to Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarian ethics. In his book, aptly titled Utilitarianism, Mill provides a summary explanation and defense of his philosophy founded on the greatest happiness principle, which states that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. In other words, what is good is what creates the most happiness for the most people. This brand of morality is under the umbrella of consequentialist ethics, meaning that when it comes to determining the morality of an action, the ends justify the means. Rand's version of rational egoism is also a consequentialist theory, but where Rand believes each person should act in their own self-interest for their own happiness, utilitarians favor lessening the focus on the self and prioritizing the happiness of everyone instead. This line of thinking would certainly appeal to someone like Sophia Lamb, who has convinced herself that turning Eleanor into an egoless atom repository would be the ultimate dissolution of the self and usher in a new utopia. And like any good consequentialist, she seems hell-bent on accomplishing this goal by any means necessary.
The city is nothing. Rapture must die so that Eleanor may rise from its body.
All her actions throughout the game, the confinement of Eleanor, the kidnapping of young girls to make into little sisters, the careless manipulation of splicers, are all done in the name of a future greater good. Still, it's pretty hard to argue that Lamb's actions are promoting happiness or hindering suffering across the board. Throughout your entire stay in the City of Rapture, the only person who seems to be having a good time is that damn clown.
Welcome to the 30th of value.
And if Lamb is really meant to be a student of Mill's philosophy, she maybe should have paid a little closer attention to the text. In his essay on liberty, Mill very clearly states that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number, is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Basically, the ends don't justify the means if it requires hurting people. Practically the entire action of the game is set around members of Lamb's collective attempting to do harm to Delta through a series of surprise attacks. The argument could be made that by attempting to free Eleanor, Delta is doing harm to the Rapture family and they're only acting in self-defense. But that argument is about as airtight as Dionysus Park. Ultimately, Lamb talks a big game about her utilitarian collectivist beliefs, but falls well short of actually being a utilitarian. Her book, Unity and Metamorphosis, excerpts of which are heard throughout the game, asserts the evolution of the human race is leading to a death of the self, a complete loss of ego, and subsequently, the end of tyranny. But in practice, Lamb is acting like a selfish tyrant. She performs dangerous experiments on her own daughter.
I am free. After everything Mother has done to me, I am alive and sane enough to be curious about the sun.
She turns young girls and men into little sisters and big daddies against their will. She kills anybody who attempts to leave Rapture, all so she can be proven right in her beliefs and create some hypothesized atom-fueled god. She would consider this to be the ultimate death of the self, but for anyone besides her, there doesn't seem to be much utility in it. In the character of Dr. Sophia Lamb, BioShock 2 attempted to create a philosophical villain that believed in everything Andrew Ryan despised and still managed to be evil. Unfortunately, it's difficult to make a truly selfless, charitable collectivist perform acts of villainy without seeming incoherent. If their philosophy is about selflessness but they're on some kind of egotistical power trip, then you can see how that might criticize the power trip more than the philosophy itself. So we're gonna have to give this section a dumb. However, if you're going to argue that the game is less criticizing the actual philosophy like in BioShock 1, and more criticizing how these philosophies are poorly implemented by tyrants, we could see how one might call it deep. Unfortunately for Sophia Lamb, the inconsistency between her beliefs and actions is only one of her problems. The other is where she lives. Part 3. Haven't we been here before? By placing the events of BioShock 2 in the same location as BioShock 1, the philosophy and actions of people like Sophia Lamb are immediately placed in the context of Ryan's world. You may be playing as a different character, but the story is a continuation of the first game in every sense of the word. So much so that it's difficult to avoid picking up audio diaries from familiar old characters filling in unnecessary plot points.
They're coming to my house expecting a show, but they're gonna get a disappearing act. Say goodbye to Fontaine, and hello to Atlas.
The game is riddled with superfluous winks and nods to stuff from BioShock 1, making this feel more like DLC than a sequel. And because of this, the villains of BioShock 2 are never given a chance to breathe. In the first BioShock, we're given glimpses of Ryan's utopia at its peak. We're shown the potential of his lofty dream, which is what makes the crumbly reality of it hit that much harder. The criticism of objectivism is more biting because we see the fallout from these beliefs. In BioShock 2, the new utopia never gets off the ground because things have already gone to hell. Lamb and her followers are attempting to rise from the ashes, but they can't shake off Ryan's ghost. Lamb presented her philosophy as an alternative to Ryan's, but her utilitarianism or anarcho-collectivism or whatever you want to call it, never manifested in the same way that Ryan's magical city at the bottom of the ocean did. And in the end, the result was the same anyway: infighting, destruction, death, and a one-way trip in a bathysphere to the surface. It's hard to effectively poke holes in a new ideology when the player is still inhabiting a world ruined by the previous one, and when the presence of said ideology is only in the antagonist's words, not in her actions. BioShock as a franchise is about how the lofty ambitions of men are doomed to fail because of inherent personal flaws. But in BioShock 2, those lofty ambitions amount to some vague talk about how a young woman is going to be turned into a utopia.
If I'm right, Eleanor's mama's using Adam to force all Rapture's minds and memories into the poor girl. Lamb reckons it'll make that child a saint.
So you're left trudging through a city you've already trudged through, all for the sake of saving your daughter, who isn't even really your daughter. Oddly enough, that's also one of the best things you can say about BioShock 2. It's trying to tell a personal, emotional story. A story about a big daddy and a little sister. A story that's either about redemption or loss of innocence, depending on how you play. For some people, that's enough, and for that reason, we'll settle on giving BioShock 2 a rating of kinda deep. Sure, the criticism of the philosophical ideologies is pretty toothless, but it has some interesting things to say about the inherent value of the self and the power of caring about someone rather than the vague notion of everyone. But what do you guys think? Is BioShock 2 a fitting sequel to one of the most revered games of all time? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks to all our patrons who support the channel and our podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and before you go, I want to give another shout out to Upstart. They reward you based on your education and job history in the form of a smarter interest rate. See why Upstart is ranked #1 in their category of over 300 businesses on Trustpilot. Go to upstart.com/wisecrack to find out how low your Upstart rate is. Checking your rate only takes a few minutes and it won't affect your credit. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.